Peking Man was supposed to be an evolutionary dead end, a primitive relic pushed aside after the rise of the out-of-Africa model turned East Asia into a human evolutionary backwater. But a stunning new protein study from China has suddenly changed the conversation. Scientists recovered molecular traces from 400,000-year-old Homo erectus teeth, and the results suggest these ancient populations were connected to mysterious Denisovan ancestry still found in living people today. Peking Man is back in the center of the human story. In the summer of 1938, while much of China was already sliding into chaos, a strange idea still survived inside a cave system near Beijing. The idea sounded almost impossible even then. A group of scientists working among shattered skulls, blackened animal bones, crude stone tools and ash layers believed they'd found not simply an ancient human, but the ancestor of humanity itself. Newspapers at the time treated the discovery with a mixture of awe and disbelief. One article from July 3rd, 1938, described Peking Man as the oldest of known human races and declared that he stood in the direct ancestral line of modern man. The article described caves filled with evidence of fire, butchered animal carcasses, broken human bones, and thick skulls with enormous brow ridges. It described a creature that walked upright, hunted, fashioned crude cutting stones, and sat around flames hundreds of thousands of years before the rise of civilization. It also described something else that still feels strangely modern today: a bitter argument over where humanity truly came from. For almost a century, the Zhoukoudian fossils have stood at the center of that argument. Before the rise of the modern out-of-Africa framework, during the late 20th century, many anthropologists openly considered East Asia one of the primary engines of human evolution. Franz Weidenreich, one of the great anatomists connected to the Peking discoveries, saw continuity stretching from Sinanthropus to later human populations across Eurasia. The article reflected that atmosphere perfectly. It described Peking Man not as an evolutionary dead end, but as a foundational figure in human history. Then, over time, the entire narrative changed. The fossils themselves vanished during the Second World War under circumstances that still remain unresolved. The original skulls disappeared while being transported out of China and were never recovered. Only casts and photographs survived. Meanwhile, genetics transformed anthropology during the late 20th century, and the new dominant framework argued that modern humanity emerged recently in Africa before spreading outward and replacing earlier populations. Under that framework, Peking Man gradually became something closer to a side branch. Fascinating, important, but ultimately disconnected from living people. Now, nearly 90 years after that article appeared, the debate has exploded back into life in a completely unexpected way. Not because somebody found a new skull, not because a cave opened somewhere in Asia, not because ancient DNA emerged from frozen bone. The shock came from proteins. Tiny fragments of enamel proteins locked inside teeth from multiple Peking Man-era individuals across China have suddenly reopened questions that many scholars believed were already settled. The new study extracted ancient enamel proteins from 6 Homo erectus individuals dating to around 400,000 years ago from Zhoukoudian, Hexian and Sunjiadong. That alone is astonishing. 400,000 years is deep time even by Ice Age standards. Protein survival at that scale borders on miraculous. Ancient DNA almost never survives in warm or fluctuating climates across much of Asia, which left enormous sections of human history almost invisible at the molecular level. Yet enamel, the hardest substance in the human body, sometimes protects microscopic biochemical traces far longer than expected. The researchers managed to recover thousands of peptide fragments from these ancient teeth and identified unique amino acid variants shared across the Chinese Homo erectus samples. One discovery in particular changes the entire discussion. The scientists identified a unique variant in the enamel protein called A253G. This variant has never been identified in modern humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans, the Dmanisi Homo erectus material from Georgia, or even other primates. In simple terms, these Chinese Homo erectus populations carried a distinctive molecular signature unlike anything yet discovered elsewhere. The fossils from Zhoukoudian, Hexian and Sunjiadong shared this signature despite spanning enormous geographic distances across northern and southern China. Then the study delivered an even more disruptive result. Another enamel protein variant called M273V appeared in all 6 Chinese Homo erectus individuals, and this same variant also appears in Denisovans and survives today in small numbers among modern populations in places such as the Philippines and parts of Oceania. The researchers argue that this signal probably entered Denisovan populations through contact with groups related to these Middle Pleistocene Homo erectus populations in East Asia. In other words, the so-called super-archaic ancestry long suspected inside Denisovan genomes suddenly has a face attached to it, or at least a species attached to it. That idea changes the emotional landscape of human origins research because it transforms Homo erectus from a distant evolutionary stage into an active genetic participant in later human history. For years, discussions about Denisovans already carried an almost ghostly quality. Nobody even knew they existed until tiny fragments from Siberia revealed a hidden human lineage. Since then, evidence connected Denisovans to Tibet, Laos, Taiwan, Siberia, and island Southeast Asia. Yet one enormous mystery remained unresolved. Who contributed the extremely ancient genetic material buried inside Denisovan genomes themselves? The answer now points toward East Asian Homo erectus populations. Suddenly, the old debates from the Peking Man era no longer sound quaint or outdated. They sound strangely alive again. The 1938 article repeatedly emphasized how human Peking Man appeared despite his primitive skull shape. He walked erect like modern man, instead of stooping and shambling like the ape, the article declared. It also described a creature with a brain volume averaging around 1,000 cubic centimeters, large teeth, thick brow ridges, and a low, flattened skull. Yet even then, researchers saw something recognizably human inside those bones. The article stressed that Peking Man controlled fire, crafted stone tools, and occupied a cultural level beyond the apes. The emotional force of the piece came from the realization that this being, however ancient or unfamiliar, belonged to the human story. Modern anthropology later pulled back from that interpretation. The dominant narrative increasingly treated Asian Homo erectus populations as peripheral to the emergence of modern humanity. Africa became the unquestioned center of origin, while Eurasian populations often became isolated branches destined for extinction. Yet the protein study quietly undermines the simplicity of that picture. It does not erase African origins for Homo sapiens. It does not suddenly prove that modern humans emerged entirely in Asia. But it does something almost as important. It demonstrates that ancient Asian populations carried unique molecular lineages that survived through later human groups and contributed to the broader genetic web of humanity. That distinction matters enormously because the old argument between out of Africa and out of Asia often becomes distorted into a false choice between total replacement and total continuity. The new evidence points towards something far messier and more fascinating. Ancient humanity did not consist of isolated species marching neatly across continents like actors entering and leaving a stage. Instead, the human story increasingly resembles overlapping populations spreading, mixing, diverging, reconnecting, and exchanging genes across enormous stretches of Eurasia over hundreds of thousands of years. The study itself openly states that the Denisovan-related variant probably originated from populations connected to these Chinese Homo erectus individuals. That means genetic echoes of populations related to Peking Man still exist today within modern humans through Denisovan ancestry. This is precisely the kind of finding that would have stunned scholars during the early 20th century. Back then, researchers argued endlessly over skull shape, brow ridges, tooth size, and brain volume. They could only speculate about ancestry through anatomy alone. Now, proteins buried inside enamel are revealing direct biological connections, stretching across hundreds of thousands of years. There is another detail inside the study that deserves far more attention than it will probably receive in mainstream coverage. The researchers found that the Hexian fossils shared the same unique protein signatures as the Jokudian individuals. That matters because some scholars previously argued that Hexian possessed traits closer to Indonesian Homo erectus or even Denisovans. The protein evidence instead places these fossils firmly within a broader East Asian Homo erectus network. In effect, the study strengthens the idea that large interconnected populations of Homo erectus existed across China during the Middle Pleistocene. That geographic scale is critical. When people imagine ancient humanity, they often picture tiny, isolated bands, barely surviving in harsh landscapes. Yet Homo erectus endured for nearly 2 million years and spread across 3 continents. The new protein evidence hints that East Asia was not some remote evolutionary cul-de-sac. It supported stable populations over immense spans of time. These populations carried distinct molecular traits and interacted with other archaic humans across the region. The implication is profound. East Asia was not simply receiving human migrations. It was generating evolutionary history internally. Even the age of the Jokudian material adds weight to the discovery. The tooth sampled in the study came from layers dating around 420,000 years ago. This places the fossils near the same general era during which Denisovans and Neanderthals themselves were beginning to diverge. The timeline suggests that multiple archaic populations occupied Eurasia simultaneously, interacting across enormous regions long before the emergence of later modern humans. The deeper one looks, the stranger the old 1938 article becomes. At moments, it almost sounds prophetic. The writer emphasized that Peking Man already possessed fire technology, tool-making abilities, upright posture, and recognizably human behavior. The article even defended Peking Man against ridicule, insisting that, with all his faults, certainly was a man. That emotional insistence mattered because scholars at the time still fought bitterly over whether these ancient beings belonged fully inside the human family. Modern molecular evidence now pushes that inclusion even further. Homo erectus was not merely human in appearance or behavior. Populations connected to East Asian Homo erectus likely contributed biologically to later archaic humans whose genetic traces survive inside living people. And suddenly another mystery returns from the shadows. The original Jokudian fossils vanished during wartime transport in the early 1940s. They disappeared somewhere between Beijing and the coast and were never recovered. For generations, that loss carried almost mythic status inside paleoanthropology. Some suspected theft, others suspected destruction during war. The original skulls that transformed 20th century anthropology simply vanished from history. Yet now, decades later, molecular traces survive inside teeth that remain behind. The fossils themselves disappeared, but their proteins endured. There is also a deeper irony buried inside the study. For years, critics of strict replacement models argued that Asia preserved long-term continuity and interaction between ancient populations. Those arguments were often dismissed as relics of outdated anthropology associated with the old Peking Man era. Yet the new protein evidence effectively restores part of that older vision, although in a more complex form. The study does not support simplistic linear ancestry from Peking Man to modern Chinese populations, but it absolutely supports long-term interaction between ancient East Asian lineages and later archaic humans. The implications extend far beyond China. If proteins can survive in Middle Pleistocene enamel under East Asian conditions, then entire regions previously considered molecular dead zones suddenly become open territory. Indonesia, Vietnam, Laos, India, and other tropical or subtropical regions contain vast numbers of ancient human fossils. Ancient DNA rarely survives there. Proteins might. That possibility changes everything, because it offers a path toward reconstructing the human story across regions that genetic research could barely touch until now. It also raises uncomfortable questions for older evolutionary assumptions. Why did these East Asian Homo erectus populations possess unique protein variants absent elsewhere? How large were their populations? How long did they remain isolated before interacting with Denisovans? Did similar lineages survive in Southeast Asia far longer than currently assumed? The study itself hints at coexistence between Homo erectus-related populations and Denisovans across East Asia. That overlap transforms the old image of isolated extinct species into a crowded Ice Age world full of contact zones and hybridization events. One detail from the 1938 article suddenly feels especially haunting. The writer described how the caves preserved the story of Peking Man and his wife. At the time, that phrase simply reflected fascination with ancient domestic life. But now, the phrase carries another meaning entirely. Those people did not vanish cleanly from the evolutionary stage. Something from their population survived, not their skull shape, not their species name, but fragments of their biology entered later human lineages and ultimately reached the present through Denisovan-connected ancestry. That realization reshapes the emotional meaning of human origins. Humanity no longer resembles a straight line beginning in one place before sweeping outward and replacing everything in its path. Instead, it resembles an enormous braided network stretching across Africa and Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years. Populations split apart, drifted, adapted, encountered one another again, exchanged genes, and disappeared while leaving fragments of themselves behind inside future peoples. The old arguments between out of Africa and out of Asia increasingly feel too crude for the complexity emerging from modern evidence. Africa unquestionably played a central role in the emergence of Homo sapiens. Yet Asia was never an empty theatre waiting for modern humans to arrive. It contained deep populations, ancient diversity, and lineages carrying genetic signals older than previously imagined. The protein evidence from Peking Man era fossils demonstrates that clearly. Perhaps the strangest part of the entire story is that the debate has returned almost exactly where it began, inside the caves of Zhoukoudian. In the 1930s, researchers stared at thick skulls and heavy jaws while trying to imagine humanity emerging from deep time. Today, scientists stare at microscopic amino acid sequences extracted from those same ancient teeth and confront an equally unsettling realization. Human history is far older, far more interconnected, and far less tidy than earlier theories allowed. The caves near Beijing still speak, not through skulls alone anymore, but through proteins hidden inside enamel for 400,000 years. Those proteins survived war, collapse, disappearance, and time itself. And now, after nearly a century of silence, they are forcing anthropology to reconsider one of the oldest questions ever asked. Not simply where humanity came from, but how many ancient people still survive inside us now. Thank you for watching. If this story fascinated you, keep following the channel because the deeper science pushes into the ancient past, the stranger the human story becomes. Entire populations once dismissed as evolutionary dead ends are returning through genetics, proteins, and forgotten fossils, revealing a world where ancient humans crossed paths, exchanged ancestry, and shaped one another in ways nobody imagined even a generation ago. The caves of Zhoukoudian still hold secrets, and the next discovery could change the entire story again.